Have you ever had the feeling that someone understood you too quickly? As if the person knew exactly what to say, exactly how to act, exactly where to touch, without you having to explain anything. And at first it feels like connection. It seems rare. It feels special. It even seems like a relief. But what if I told you that, in many cases, this is not empathy? It's reading. And worse. It's calculation. This video is not comfortable. It wasn't made to distract you. It was made to show you something that perhaps you never realized. There are people who observe invisible signs in you and use it as a map, an emotional map. Today, you will understand exactly what signs manipulators use to identify emotional vulnerability and how this happens in your everyday life, in simple, almost imperceptible things, ordinary conversations, small reactions, silences, things you do without even realizing it. And perhaps most uncomfortable of all, you don't have to be weak to be chosen. It just needs to be predictable. Because manipulators don't look for broken people, they look for patterns. Now answer me one thing, and be honest with yourself. Do you tend to over-explain yourself when someone misunderstands you? Think about it, because this type of behavior, which seems just polite or mature, can be read differently by those observing. And that's exactly what you'll start to see now. The signs are not obvious. They are not dramatic. They are subtle. And that's why they work. Throughout this video, you will notice situations that you have probably already experienced. Moments when you thought you were creating a connection, but in reality, you were being analyzed. And the more you understand this, the more you begin to regain control. Because the problem was never feeling too much. The problem is not realizing when someone is using it against you. If at any point in this video something makes too much sense, comment. Not for me. But because this type of awareness needs to be shared among people who are beginning to see beyond the obvious. There are more people going through this than you might think. And in a way, if you're here, maybe you've already felt that there's something wrong in certain relationships. Maybe you just haven't been able to explain it yet. But today, this is starting to take shape. And before you continue, keep this in mind. Manipulators do not invade. They enter when the door is ajar. And the most dangerous? Sometimes, it was you who left it. Now begins the part that almost no one notices. Manipulators don't come asking about your traumas, your pain, or your insecurities. They don't need it. What they do is much quieter and much more efficient. They watch. And it's not a common observation. It's almost as if they are putting together a puzzle with small pieces of their everyday behavior. One detail here, another one there. And suddenly, you are already understood, without realizing it. For example, the way you react when someone interrupts you. Do you retreat? Do you insist? Or do you give in quickly to avoid conflict? It looks small, but it's not. This shows how you deal with social pressure. Another almost invisible point. When someone makes a light joke about you, how do you respond? Do you laugh together, even though you're uncomfortable? Do you defend yourself? Or do you pretend you didn't feel it? This reveals something deeper than it seems. It reveals how willing you are to ignore your own discomfort to maintain acceptance. And here comes the first break that many people don't expect. Manipulators don't seek excitement. They look for reaction. Because it is in the reaction that you reveal yourself. Not in what you say, but in what you can't hide. A look that looks away too quickly. A smile that appears out of time. An attempt to explain something that no one asked for. These are signs, and they are extremely valuable for anyone who can read. There is a very common pattern, for example, in people who have been emotionally invalidated throughout their lives. They tend to justify their feelings before even expressing them. I know it may sound silly, but maybe I'm exaggerating, but do you understand what is happening here? Before you speak, you are already asking for permission, and that for a manipulator is practically an invitation, because it shows that there is active internal insecurity. And insecurity, when not recognized, becomes an access point. Now think about something even more everyday. Messages. Yes, messages. the time it takes you to respond, the size of your answers, how much you explain yourself, how much you try to keep the conversation alive. All of this communicates something. If you respond too quickly, always available, always engaged, this may indicate a need for validation. If you write long texts trying to make yourself understood, this may indicate fear of being misunderstood. And here's a micro-revelation that changes everything. Manipulators don't connect with what you say. They connect with what you show you need. And that completely changes the game. Because from that moment on, interaction stops being about exchange and becomes about exploration. But none of this is explicit. It's subtle, almost imperceptible. And that's why so many people enter into manipulative relationships without realizing the exact moment they lost control. There is no landmark. There is no alert. There is an accumulation. Small concessions, little silences, small adaptations. And when you realize it, you are already emotionally involved. Now, if this is starting to make sense in an uncomfortable way, note one more thing. Manipulators pay close attention to how you talk about others. If you constantly justify bad behavior from others, if you always try to understand the other side, if you avoid judging even when something clearly hurts you, this reveals something specific. You tolerate more than you should, and excessive tolerance, when combined with empathy, becomes perfect breeding ground, because it shows that you don't react quickly, and those who don't react quickly are easier to mold. Maybe you've never thought of it that way. Maybe you've always seen this as a quality, and in many contexts it is, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a tool against you, and this is where perception begins to change. Because the problem is not who you are. It's up to those who know how to read exactly that. If you've noticed any of these signs in yourself, don't ignore them. There's a pattern forming, and in the next few moments, this will become even clearer. Much clearer. There is a point at which this stops being just observation and starts to become a pattern. A pattern that, if you don't see it, someone will see it for you. And not in the way you would like. Because here's something almost no one talks about clearly. Manipulators aren't interested in who you are when you're well. They pay attention to who you become when there is a little tension in the room. A delay, a different answer, a change of tone, minimal things. But they activate micro-adjustments in your behavior. And it is exactly in these micro-adjustments that the pattern appears. Do you try to fix the mood too quickly? Do you change your behavior to avoid discomfort? Do you take on emotional responsibility that isn't even yours? Do you see how this has nothing to do with weakness? This is much more sophisticated. It's emotional predictability. And this predictability is gold for those who manipulate. Because when someone can predict how you react, they don't need to force you. She just needs to provoke the right stimulus. And you do the rest yourself. This is the point where most people get it wrong. They think manipulation is something aggressive, direct, almost obvious. But in practice, it is silent. It happens within your own behavior. You start to adjust your tone of voice, start choosing your words better, start avoiding certain topics, and it all feels natural. It's just not spontaneous. It's an answer. Now pay attention to this. There is a huge difference between sensitivity and constant adaptation. Sensitivity is perceiving the environment. Constant adaptation is molding yourself into it, all the time. And when this becomes the standard, you stop being someone who interacts and become someone who adjusts without realizing it. This is the type of person that manipulators identify easily, not because she is weak, but because she anticipates emotionally. She tries to avoid conflict before it even exists. She tries to maintain harmony, even if it costs something internally. And here comes a contrast that almost no one can accept at first. What you've always seen as maturity may be exactly what makes you vulnerable. Being too understanding, be too patient, being too flexible. In excess, this is not strength, it's opening. And openness, without limits, becomes access. Now think about simple situations in your everyday life. Someone changes their behavior towards you, becomes colder, more distant, and you immediately start to analyze what you did wrong. Even without evidence, even without confirmation. This is not empathy. This is emotional conditioning. And manipulators recognize this quickly, because they know they don't need to confront you. Just change the environment, and you yourself will try to correct yourself. Alone, without anyone asking, without anyone charging. This is the most dangerous level of predictability, because it works without external effort. Now let me tease you with an uncomfortable realization. If someone can predict your reactions, that person can manage your emotions. And if you can manage your emotions, you can manage your decisions. And at that point, manipulation no longer needs to feel like manipulation. It becomes dynamic. It becomes routine. It becomes the way of the relationship. If this bothers you a little, it's because it's starting to make sense. And those who begin to realize this rarely manage to ignore it again, because once you see the pattern, you start seeing him everywhere. In old verses, in past relationships, in situations that, at the time, seemed normal. And maybe now you understand why some connections drained you so much. It wasn't intensity. It was constant adjustment. It was you trying to maintain something that was already being shaped. And the most disturbing thing, this probably started with small signs, so small that you didn't even consider them important. But someone considered. I am. Now the question is no longer whether this happens. The question is, how many times have you been predictable without realizing it? At some point, observation stops being passive, and it becomes a test, but not a direct, obvious test, as most people imagine. There is no clear question. There is no open situation. The test is subtle, almost invisible, and it happens when you least expect it. It may be a slightly cross comment, a sudden change in mood, an unexpected silence in the middle of a conversation that seemed normal. Nothing big, nothing that justifies a strong reaction. And that's exactly why it works. Because the goal is not to confront you. It's measuring you. Measure how much you tolerate, how much you question, how much do you position yourself, or how much you adjust. Now change perspective for a moment. Imagine someone watching you, not with emotional interest, but with strategic curiosity. This person says something a little out of place and waits. She doesn't need to do anything else. Just watch your response. If you ignore it, point noted. If you laugh, even when uncomfortable, point noted. If you try to smooth over the situation, one more point. Do you understand? Your every reaction becomes information, and this information begins to build a profile, an access profile. This is the moment when the manipulator begins to understand how far he can go. No risk, no exposure, because you are showing the limits, without realizing that you are being tested. Now comes the annoying part. These tests do not happen once. They are repeated, with small variations. A more direct comment, a slightly cooler attitude, a slight break in expectations. And with each repetition, one thing is analyzed. Do you react or do you absorb? Because whoever reacts creates a barrier, but whoever absorbs creates space. And emotional space, for those who manipulate, is opportunity. Maybe you've already been through this. That feeling that something was strange, but you didn't say anything. He preferred to let it go. He preferred not to create a problem. He preferred to maintain the atmosphere. And in that very moment, something was learned about you. No conversation, no deal, no conscience, just behavior. Now hold this sentence. Manipulators do not need to exceed their limits. They wait for you to move the limits, little by little, alone. And when you realize it, what used to bother you starts to seem normal, not because it changed, but because you adapted. This is the cumulative effect of silent testing. They don't break you all at once. They adjust you, gradually. And here comes a detail that almost no one notices. Often the manipulator does not demonstrate negative intent in this process. On the contrary, he may seem interested, present, even caring. And this confuses even more, because while it tests your limits, it also creates connection. A connection that feels genuine, but in practice it is being calibrated. The intensity, the timing, the responses, everything starts to adjust based on what you allow. Now think about something simple. Someone takes longer to respond to you, without explanation. You feel, but he doesn't speak. Next time it will take even longer, and you remain silent. What does this communicate? That this behavior is acceptable, and from there, it becomes standard. Not because it was agreed, but because it was allowed. And that is the essence of silent testing. It's not about what the other person does. It's about what you don't interrupt. If this is starting to bother you, it's a good sign. Because it means you are leaving automatic. And when you leave the automatic, it becomes more difficult to be read so easily. But there's still something deeper going on here. Something that defines the next step. Because after the test comes the decision. And not everyone notices when it happens. But it happens. Always. There is a specific moment when everything changes. Not externally, but internally. For those who are watching you. So far you have been analyzed, tested, measured. Now comes the silent part that defines the game. The decision. And it doesn't happen with drama. There is no clear landmark, no conversation, no obvious sign. It's almost cold. Almost mathematical. The manipulator, after observing your patterns, comes to a simple conclusion. Is it worth investing here? And that decision has nothing to do with who you are as a person. It has to do with how much you react, or how much you absorb. Because those who react require effort. But whoever absorbs it, offers access. Now hold this. They choose those who don't react, not those who are weak, not those who are naive. Who doesn't react. And that completely changes the how you understand relationships. Because many times, you believed you were being understanding, mature, patient. But, in the reading of those who manipulate, you were being accessible. And emotional accessibility, without clear limits, is not seen as a virtue. It is seen as an opportunity. Now think about common situations. Someone cancels something with you at the last minute. And you understand. Someone changes their tone, and you adjust yours. Someone makes a mistake, and you quickly get over it. None of this in isolation seems problematic. But when it becomes a standard, it communicates something specific. You don't create friction, and those who don't create friction don't impose resistance. And that's exactly what defines the choice. Because manipulation is not about controlling someone by force. It's about finding someone who can control themselves, depending on the other. This is the most delicate point. You start to observe yourself more, measuring what you say, avoiding conflicts, maintaining balance. And while that sounds like maturity, in practice it can be self-silencing. And manipulators recognize this accurately, because they know they don't need to pressure. You already do this work. Now comes a realization that changes everything. The more you try to maintain harmony alone, the more you facilitate imbalance. Because the relationship is no longer an exchange, and it becomes compensation. You make up for the other person's silence. It compensates for the coldness, make up for the absence. And this creates an invisible dynamic, a dynamic where only one side sustains, and the other drives. Effortless. Now notice a detail that usually goes unnoticed. Once the decision is made, behavior changes. Subtly, the person begins to allow themselves more delays, more mood swings, more inconsistency, and it's not carelessness, it's an advanced test. Because now there is already a hypothesis formed, that person won't react, and behavior begins to confirm this hypothesis, or not. But most of the time, it confirms, because you've shown this before, in the little moments, in small concessions, in the small silences. Now answer me and feel the weight of it. How many times have you called normal something that deep down bothered you? just to avoid creating tension. This is the exact point where the decision comes to fruition, not in what the other person does, but what do you allow to continue? And there is a very fine line here between being someone balanced and be someone who accepts too much, between being someone empathetic and be someone who abandons themselves little by little. And when that line is crossed, manipulation does not need to begin, because in a way, it has already started. No ad, no explicit intention, standard only. And now that the choice has been made, the next step is not to test, it's using. And that's where a lot of people are already too involved to notice. From the moment the choice is made, the dynamics change almost imperceptibly. There is no sudden turnaround. There is no now it starts. There is continuity. But beneath this continuity, something is already underway. The trap. And it doesn't look like a trap. On the contrary, it feels like connection, with proximity, with interest, with presence. And that's what disarms. Because while you feel like something is being built, something is already being used. Now pay attention to this calmly. Manipulators don't create emotional dependence out of thin air. They magnify something that already exists within you. A need for validation, a desire to be understood, a desire for deeper connection. None of this is wrong. But when someone identifies exactly which of these needs is most active, that person can shape the way they approach it. And here comes a psychological fact that almost no one notices on a daily basis. The human brain tends to trust those who validate emotions more quickly before creating real consistency. In other words, if someone makes you feel understood too soon, you tend to let your guard down. And it is in this space that the trap sets in. Because initial validation is not constant. She is strategic. Come at the right time, at the right intensity, with the right words. And then, it slows down. Not completely, but enough to generate a strange sensation, a slight miss, a silent doubt. And here something crucial happens. You start looking for that initial feeling again, without realizing it. Start trying harder, to adjust more, trying to recover something that seemed natural at the beginning, but it wasn't. It was calibrated. Now hold this turn. The connection you're trying to maintain was designed for you to chase, and this completely changes the role within the relationship, because before you responded, now you search. Before you reacted, now you anticipate. And at that point, the trap is already working. No imposition, no pressure, just behavior. Now observe a pattern that happens frequently. At first, the person seems extremely present. Pay attention. Interested. Then, small absences appear. Small departures, nothing extreme, but enough to create instability. And this instability activates something profound, the need to restore balance. And whoever tries to restore gets more involved, invest more, tolerate more. That's the mechanism. It is not direct control. It's emotional induction. And here's a breakdown that many people avoid facing. The more you try to understand others, the less you realize what is happening to you, because your attention is directed outward, always trying to interpret, justify, adjust. And meanwhile, the internal structure is being shaped. No resistance. Now think about how many times you felt like you needed to make it work, even when something wasn't clear, even when there were strange signs, even when you didn't feel completely comfortable. This doesn't come out of nowhere. This is built, little by little, and reinforced at strategic moments. A compliment here, an approximation there, and a validation at the exact moment. And it keeps you in, connected, available. Now breathe and face this. The emotional trap does not trap you in pain. She holds on to hope. Hope to return to the beginning. Hope to keep something that felt special. Hope that it could still be genuine. And that's what keeps a lot of people in cycles they don't understand. It's not weakness, it's conditioning. And manipulators understand this deeply, because they know exactly when to give and when to withdraw. And this rhythm creates dependence, not explicit, but functional. Now tell me something, just for yourself. Have you ever found yourself trying to recover a version of someone who only existed in the beginning? If the answer is yes, then you have already felt this dynamic. Maybe not with that name, but with this weight. And the longer this goes on, it becomes harder to understand where it started, and it becomes easier to continue, because at this point, you are no longer just reacting. You are involved. And when there is involvement, seeing becomes much more difficult, but not impossible. And that's exactly where everything starts to change. At some point, you can no longer put everything into someone else. And this is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of all, because up until now, you have been able to observe signs, patterns, external behaviors. But now, the focus changes. Come back to you, not as guilt, but as consciousness, because there is something silent that sustains this type of dynamic, and almost no one likes to look at it, the way you allow it. And before this sounds too heavy, understand one thing clearly. Allowing is not choosing to suffer. It's not realizing what is being accepted in small doses. That's where it all comes together. Not in big decisions, but in micro concessions. Now pay attention to this calmly. Every time something bothers you, and you ignore it. Every time you feel discomfort, and you rationalize it. Every time you adapt, so as not to create conflict. You are teaching something about how it can be treated. Speechless, no warning, just behavior. And the most disturbing thing? You do this by trying to maintain something. A relationship, a climate, a connection. But in the process, you may be moving away from yourself. This is the subtlest point, because outwardly, it looks like you are being balanced, but internally, there is an accumulation, small unexpressed annoyances, small dissatisfactions saved, little parts of you being left aside. And that creates a space where others grow, and you shrink, without realizing it. Now hold this question, and don't answer quickly. At what point did you start to adjust more than express yourself? Because this turning point doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little, almost imperceptible, until it becomes standard. And when it becomes standard, you don't even notice it anymore. You just act. Avoid certain topics. Think twice before speaking. Measure reactions. And it all seems normal. But it is not neutral. It's continuous adaptation. And continuous adaptation, without awareness, becomes self-abandonment. That's a word that few people use, but that explains a lot. Because it's not the other person who erases you, it's you who starts to reduce yourself, to maintain something that is no longer balanced. And manipulators don't create that. They find it, and they expand. Now comes a difficult twist to accept. The more you try to be understanding without limits, the more predictable you become. And the more predictable, the easier to drive. Not because you are weak, but why don't you interrupt yourself? You continue. Even when something doesn't fit. Even when something weighs. Even when something doesn't make sense. And this creates a silent dynamic. You adapt. The other advances. You adjust. The other expands. And so, little by little, the space is being occupied. Now notice an important detail. Many people only realize this when they are tired, when they already feel drained, when they no longer recognize their own way of acting. And then the doubt arises. How did I get here? But the answer is rarely in a specific moment. It's on repeat. In the little ones, let it go. With little ones, it's not worth talking. In the little, I'll see about it later. And when you add it all up, there is an absence. Yours. Now, if this is touching on some deeper point, don't ignore it. Because this type of perception does not appear by chance. It appears when you are ready to see something that previously went unnoticed. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to realize that it's not about protecting yourself from others all the time. It's about learning not to abandon yourself in the process. Because when you don't abandon yourself, it becomes much more difficult for someone to occupy this space. And it doesn't require extreme strength. It requires presence, conscience, interruption, and that changes everything, or almost everything, because there is still one last point, a point that defines whether you keep repeating or start to break. And it's simpler than it seems, but also harder than most are willing to face. In the end, it all comes down to a choice that almost never feels like a choice, because it doesn't happen at a great moment. There is no clear scene, a striking decision, a now that has changed. It happens in detail, the moment something bothers you, and you decide whether to listen to it or ignore it once again. And this is where the cycle breaks, or repeats itself, because after everything you've seen so far, there is a truth that can no longer be ignored. You don't control who tries to manipulate you, but you control how accessible you remain to it. And that difference completely changes the game. It's not about becoming someone cold. It's not about distrusting everything. It's not about closing yourself off. It's something quieter, more difficult, more real. Realizing when something is not aligned, and not abandoning yourself to maintain that. It seems simple, but it's not, because it goes against old standards. It goes against the need to please. It goes against the impulse to avoid conflict. It goes against the fear of losing connection. And that's exactly why most don't do it. Prefer to adjust. Prefer to adapt. Prefer to continue. Even feeling it. Mainly feeling. Now make this very clear within yourself. Feeling that something is wrong is enough of a sign. You don't need proof. No external confirmation is required. You don't need the other person to admit it. Your discomfort already communicates something. But the question is, do you respect that? Or negotiate that? Because every time you negotiate internal discomfort, you weaken your own perception. And the more this happens, the less you trust yourself, and the less you trust yourself, but you look for reference in others. And this is the perfect terrain. The terrain where manipulation need not be forced. It just happens. Now pay attention to this final twist. Handlers are not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is that you get used to not hearing yourself. Because when that happens, anyone who knows how to read behavior finds space. And there's no need to invade. You are already open. Now if you've made it this far, there's something important going on. You are no longer at the same point as before, because now you've seen it. You connected. You noticed patterns that previously went unnoticed. And that creates responsibility. Not with others. Like you. With what you feel, with what you perceive, with what you tolerate. And that doesn't mean you'll never go through situations like this again. But it does mean that next time, there will be a moment, a small moment, where you will notice something, one detail, a discomfort, an inconsistency. And in that moment, you decide, not the other one. You, if it continues, or it stops. And if this content made you see something that was previously confusing, don't keep it to yourself. Share. Because there are many people living exactly this type of dynamic, without being able to name it. And when someone starts to see, this creates an effect of collective consciousness. And if you want, comment too. Not with long explanations, but with something simple. What made you realize most about this process? Because when you put it into words, you reinforce it within yourself, and it helps others understand too. This space here is not about ready-made answers. It's about seeing better, together, because those who start to see find it difficult to accept going back to automatic mode. And maybe that's exactly what brought you here. Now save that last sentence, and don't forget her. Or you learn to recognize the signs, or someone learns to use theirs better.